Can everyone hear me okay? Good. So my name is Alan Mond. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called MuniRent, and we do equipment sharing for large government agencies. But today, I'm really honored to introduce the next speaker, which is Sarah Allen, and she is an innovation specialist at 18F. Sarah and I met in a very appropriate place for this talk. I'll let your imaginations run wild for a little bit there. But the place that we met was a hackathon that was sponsored by 18F and a few nonprofits in the Bay Area. And the point of the hackathon was to expose open source web applications that were hosted by 18F for developers to improve on them and maybe come up with new features. So I'm really excited to have Sarah join us, take time out of her busy schedule. So a big round of applause for her.
Thanks, Alan. So on a government timescale, I'm very new to this. I have been working with government for about 2.5 years. In the audience, who works for government, some kind of government? Anybody not work for government? All right. Any feds? No, I'm the only one. State? Local, city government? A few of you? All right. So yeah, I've been working, I'm a federal employee. I work at 18F, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. 18F is a digital consultancy inside the federal government. Everybody who works for 18F is a federal employee, and we do services for other federal agencies. And I'll give you a brief history about how this interesting story came about. In 2011, Todd Park, our former US CTO, started the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program. So this was his brainchild of, he assessed that the problem we had in technology was really a talent problem. We didn't have the people inside government who really lived and breathed this stuff and could change it and bring these fresh ideas in. So this was his brainchild, like, let's give it a fancy name, we'll call it presidential, we'll attract industry talent, and and sucked me in 2012. In 2012, the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program, which was run out of the White House, and anybody who knows anything about the federal government, you might know the White House actually has very little staff who aren't empowered to do many, many things. So the second year, the General Services Administration, which is like, runs all the federal buildings in the United States of America, the government's landlord. They do a lot of services that just kind of help our executive branch go. They said, okay, well, we'll house this program. We'll do the administrative overhead stuff for it. So the Fellows Program moved to the General Services Administration the year that I started in 2013. And then we were there for 6 months to a year. And after, actually, well, about, I don't know if you guys remember, October 2013, the federal government shut down for a little while. So it turned out many of the, depending on how you were funded and these strange set of rules, a whole bunch of us couldn't actually go to work. And so they were hanging out saying, well, what are we going to do when our term is up in December? So 8 of my colleagues started 18F with this idea that they weren't quite done yet, that there were some problems in the federal government that maybe would take more than 6 months to a year to solve. And many of them had been working on problems, and when you work for the federal government, and I don't know if this happens in the state, but like there are some civil servants who are like, we'll see you in another 4 years, you'll be gone and we'll still be here, so let's have another meeting. So they wanted to be there to work through some of these problems. So that's how 18F began. And the General Services Administration was super supportive of this idea because they'd been wanting to do it for years. They didn't know how to get talent there. And so here was talent saying, hey, we want to fix these problems. And so 18F was born. So now 18F is huge. We're 165 people. In 2 years, any group that grows that big, that fast, it's a little crazy. We hardly ever get together in one room. This is from an offsite that we had on-site all-hands thing where we all got together. But usually, we're in different places. I live in San Francisco. This is the federal office building at Civic Center where I work with about 30 colleagues. But most of the time, we work like this. We have lots of different video conferencing, document sharing solutions, and we are all remote teams. What we decided to do was to hire where the talent is, which is all over the United States, and leverage the fact that we're in the General Services Administration, which is all over the United States, to prove that we can do remote work when we're doing software, which is like a thing. So our mission is to transform how the United States government builds, buys, and shares digital services. So what does that mean? We put the needs of the American people first. We are design-centric, agile, open, and data-driven. So these are the principles by which we do everything, and we believe that we should always be shipping. We say that delivery is the strategy. This is a slightly reworded, stolen from the government digital service in the UK. But that by delivering with agency partners, that's how we're going to change the system. You don't know how to do it until you do it. Now the government, the federal government, spends $80 billion on IT services every year. There is no way one little group inside the GSA is going to tackle that number. But our goal is to change how we're spending that money, to spend it smarter. I'm not sure that that's too big a number because there's a lot of paper that goes on in the federal government. But I certainly know that money is not being spent wisely, and we're trying to fix that. So our mission is really one of culture change. So there's been a bunch of research on culture change. And the way that the researchers believe it happens is by latching on to new behaviors. And when people do new behaviors and they lead to results that matter, that's when culture change happens. And we've seen this in our work. People kind of don't necessarily believe, but when they see it, when they experience it, the change is dramatic. And they can take that home to their agencies. And the teams can replicate that even beyond when we're working with them. So delivery is the strategy. We just start. We build MVPs. Who's heard of this word? A few people. This is, in industry speak, we call it a minimally viable product. Eric Ries, who catalyzed the lean startup movement, defines a minimally viable product as the smallest possible thing you can learn from. So this isn't necessarily even software. Maybe it's a paper prototype. Maybe it's a mock-up. Maybe it's observing some human interactions. That's where we start. We learn something, we iterate, we do it again, until we have a solution that actually meets the needs of the people we're building it for. So a few things we do, think like a designer. So we want everyone on the team to take a human-centered approach and have all of our decisions be driven by the needs of the people who are using the software. Agile practices, build, measure, repeat. Quick feedback loops. We fail small so that we don't fail big, right? So it's not that we're embracing failure, we're embracing learning. And as Jen Polka, former deputy CTO and founder of Code for America, says, we want to leverage the low cost of experimentation. We want to do small things inexpensively so we figure things out on the way to doing the big things. We're data-driven. We believe in instrumenting everything with analytics to support the user needs. So we know which parts of the software people are using. We measure everything for open data projects. We believe in API first so that when we build a user experience, other people can use the APIs to build experiences that are tuned to their needs. We're open by default. We work in the open. We'll talk a bunch about this today. Everything we do is open source, and we believe in radical transparency and evangelism of everything we do, because when we figure out something that works, we want it to be replicated so every one of our federal colleagues can use the same practices. We believe in being the change. We lead by example. We set a really high bar for ourselves to do the things that are going to work, even if we don't know what they are yet. So we do instruction and hands-on assistance. And so one example of this, before I get to that, how we work. So most of the digital service programs in the federal government are actually appropriated by Congress. 18F works like GSA does, which is that all of our work must be paid for by other agencies. We're governed by what's called the Economy Act. What this does is it creates this resiliency in our team, so we don't have to rely on funding that happens every year. And it also, I think, keeps us honest that as long as agencies want our work, then we can continue. So I want to tell you something that we did with California, which is unusual. When we first started, we didn't think we could work with state and local government except by, you guys can use our open source and stuff like that. But in California, the federal government actually provides funds for state welfare programs, including for IT systems. And this was mentioned this morning. And California has 500,000 allegations of child abuse and neglect every year, and they've got this antiquated system that isn't really serving the need of tracking all of those reports. So they estimated that the cost was going to be $400 to $500 million, which included the 50% federal match. And that's, that's a kind of a steep ticket, but this is, I guess, a complicated system. Their approach originally was to make one big procurement, because that's kind of the thing that governments do. But one of the things that this is really common, that it's considered too important to fail, yet the approach that they were taking, was creating a high risk of failure. Because even though it feels comfortable to go to a vendor and be like, okay, now you are responsible for delivering this thing, in reality, sometimes it doesn't get delivered, right? And it's 5 years later, and you don't have the thing, and you spent the money, and we can't afford to delegate responsibilities to vendors who, aren't actually, there's limitations to how we can hold them accountable. But there's other methodologies. So a bunch of people got involved, including 18F's RFP ghostwriting team, which was hired by the Federal Health and Human Services to help the state of California. So they transformed a 1,500-page request for proposal into 2 70-page modular RFPs, right? And they actually revised the state's terms and conditions for greater competitiveness around Agile and around open source. And this was done by a whole bunch of people working together. So it was state government leaders, Code for America, and a whole bunch of other people that I don't even know. And if you want to work with us, you can email this, inquiries18f@gsa.gov, and a whole bunch of these lovely people will be on the other end of that email. So that's a really interesting story, and I learned about it primarily to share with you. I can answer some questions about it, but I've told you most of what I know. So we also make software. So I'm on the software side. I'm formally a product manager at 18F. My background is in developing software. I've done a little bit of design as well. And when we make software, we always start with a problem. Now you might think, well, of course, why would we make software except to solve a problem? But you might be surprised how many people leap to the solution. People just assume that we know what the problem is. And people get very excited about the thing we're going to build. But we find that by really digging into the problem, by understanding the problems that our people are having before the software exists, and articulating that problem, that we actually make better software. So I'm going to tell you a story of a particular piece of software that I worked on, which starts with this problem. So over 37% of federal employees believe that creativity and innovation are rewarded, right? So this is like less than 40% of federal employees actually think that their work is going to make a big difference. And this is like a lot of agencies are very, very concerned about this stat. The Office of Personnel Management is pretty upset. And generally, people kind of think about the, the beleaguered federal workers who are working under these like terrible constraints and woe is us, what are we going to do about it? So one of my colleagues pointed out that the American workers, it's worse, which surprised me, but I guess the work world is not what we'd like it to be. But embedded in any problem, sometimes there's an opportunity. So there are 2.7 million federal employees. That means 1 million federal employees think that creativity and innovation are rewarded. This is our target audience. So what we had this insight that, well, and some evidence, that these people who believed actually were the best people to engage with. That if you do, sort of counterintuitively to some people, there were some programs that were trying to help the most unmotivated, right? And those programs were not as successful as some innovative programs that helped the most motivated, right? Because those people get super excited, and then other people would see what they do and get super excited about that. And this turned out to be a really key insight. So we sort of started based on the assumption that cross-team collaboration actually increases the impact of federal workers while providing professional development opportunities. And this we actually found validated by user research, which was very exciting. So remember, delivery is the strategy. So when we design things, like what does it mean to deliver things? What we're actually delivering is the human experiences that happen outside of the software. When we build software these days, right? Not like the old days, like when I started coding, and you built software so that you would like make a document on a computer that wasn't connected to anything and like print it out or put it on a videotape, and then that was the thing, right? We used to make software to make documents. Now we make software that causes actual things to happen in the real world, right? And we make software that inspires social experiences. And in this case, we wanted to make software that inspired collaboration and inspires a whole bunch of things that are happening completely outside the software. And so we wanted to design that human experience and then use software to make it scale. So, so back to the research, culture change happens best when you leverage what's already happening within the culture. And then you take a few key behaviors and amplify them, emphasize those, and then employees kind of get into that and do more of that. So, so the thing that we wanted to amplify and the behavior that we focused on is this idea of providing an opportunity that somebody else would work on. Because what we found is that the people who were successful at collaborating cross agencies, cross teams, were people who had been in the federal government for a really long time and were very, very highly networked. And so by allowing anybody to post these opportunities and allowing anybody to look at these opportunities, that would then provide this environment, and that's what we've seen. So as an example of that, the White House last fall used this platform to post this opportunity for a citizen science toolkit that they wanted to create. And we had 5 people sign up. Now normally when the White House has no problem finding some people to work on their stuff. But usually it's the same suspects. And actually I talked to somebody from the Office of Science and Technology, which is in the White House, and he said it was actually very time-consuming usually to find people to work on things because the first time you call a meeting, all the managers go, right? Because they're being invited to the White House, and that's really exciting. Except that you actually want the people who are the hands-on, the engineers, the people who are subject matter experts. So it usually takes a few meetings to get to the people you actually want on your work group. But here they could immediately start with the people who had the right, skill sets to work on this. And some of these people had never had any contact with the White House before. Like, You know, of those 2.7 million federal workers, very few of them have the opportunity to work directly with the White House. And it's kind of a big deal if you work for the federal government. So one of them, the WordPress developer, built this site for the White House and gave a talk where she talked about what a big deal it was to build this WordPress site for the White House. And so this had a significant effect on her career and, you know, actually got some stuff done. So this is, you know, just showing evidence, one story of this kind of professional development. And we see it with like really important mission-led things like this, as well as more mundane things, you know, guest blog posts, JavaScript widgets, all different types of small opportunities that it can still be important in somebody's professional development and can be the important of getting, you know, sort of a government work done. So, so the way that we achieve culture change, both within this product and sort of 18F at large, is focusing on key behaviors. What is the change we want to see, and how do we encourage those behaviors to happen? Working within and with the existing culture. We identify the best people, the people who really want to make it happen, who we think kind of get it. And then we work with them, and we reinforce their success. The other thing that we did as a part of this research for this particular project, where we did research for the Office of Personnel Management, was to identify positive culture traits. So what's a positive culture trait of the federal government, or the government in general? It turns out that despite you know, some common misperceptions about government employees, most government employees are very mission-driven. They really, whatever their agency is, whatever their task is set for them, they usually feel very, very inspired to make it happen. The other thing that surprised me is that we have a culture of data-driven learning. So I discovered this a little bit, or I gained this insight by talking to our former GSA administrator, Dan Tanglerini, because I was sharing with him my frustration, because I come from industry, where I was like, yeah, we have this whole culture of fail fast, but that doesn't like really resonate with my government colleagues. And he was like, yeah, we don't get into failure that much. But he said, if you shift that around, the reason you want to fail fast is because you want to learn. And we're big on learning in government. You know, all those government reports, those millions of papers we write every year, that's because we want to do things that are evidence-based. So if we can shift the, that learning and that data capture, which is usually just captured in words on paper, and if we can shift that into the digital realm, then we're augmenting, amplifying culture that already exists and just teaching new techniques. So another thing that government does is makes a lot of documents. So when we set out to do this project, it was actually part of this big digital government strategy. Then 2011, there was an executive order, and then in 2012, there was this digital government strategy that emphasized doing things like crowdsourcing. There was so here's a quote from the strategy that says that, you know, like, these are the kinds of things that we want to do. We want to leverage public crowdsourcing. We want to launch shared services. We want to do all these new things. And there was like an Office of Personnel Management memo. And it turns out that like these kind of documents are helpful, which surprises me. You know, like I'm not big on words. Coming from industry, you know, you don't think of those things as being very powerful. But in the federal government, when you're an individual worker, if you can point to, you know, one of these big memos, sometimes those things are very, very significant. However, they're not sufficient. You can't just write a memo and create culture change, as it turns out. So through our research, we also found that one of the things that makes a big difference is having stakeholders at every level, right? Not just somebody at the top who writes a memo, but having supervisors and managers, individual employees, senior executives, unions, outside supporters. The more people you can have in different places matters more than the amount of people that you have supporting you. But you don't have to get intimidated by this. You don't have to start this way. You can start with one person. And one person gets another group of people together. You start proving that it's possible, and then you build the whole support. So I want to share with you this story of how this one program got started. This was actually inside a different team inside the General Services Administration, who they were inspired to do this crowdsourcing, initially to get their own work done, but then more broadly to foster cross-agency collaboration. And they started with a WordPress blog. So every one of these opportunities was posted. This is like a separate WordPress post, and this button would literally send an email to the person who ran this program. And Lisa Nelson would then introduce people to each other and be like, okay, go team. And then when they said it got finished, then she would update the post on the WordPress blog to say it was completed. And this sounds crazy, but this is actually like the lean startup people call this the Concierge Approach. You model the whole software stack with just a little bit of tech and human interactions, because that's so much cheaper than writing software, and you can figure out how this works. So we had this whole model. And then we scaled it using software. So here we go. We leveraged some open source software from the State Department, and we deployed open opportunities for federal-wide to support this program. So it was able to scale far beyond what one person would be able to administer, because we automated a lot of the things that Lisa had been doing by hand. And so she still does a lot of community management, but then the software handles all the introductions and so forth. And then we took all of the changes and improvements by working with this federal-wide task-sharing program, and we put them back into the open source software, including this, this landing page which articulates the benefits of this. So we created this landing page by interviewing a lot of people who had been using open opportunities, who'd been doing this cross-agency task sharing through this WordPress blog, and we took their words of how they described it and how they described what value they saw in it in order to make the page that then amplified the program for other federal employees, and then we baked that all back into the open source software. Which brings me to the end of my story, to talk a little bit about open source. So open source has been mentioned a lot today. Before today, who had heard of open source? About half of you. Who's used open source? A few people. Anybody built open source? All right, a couple people. Well, open source, I think I have a definition here. Yes. So open source software is software where the code is open and freely available for modification or enhancement by anyone. Actually, traditionally, in the olden days, before I was even coding, in the 60s, software used to ship always with the source code because software was used by engineers, and often they had to modify it. And then in that version of open source, it wasn't necessarily even free. Like, you had to pay for it, but then you had the software available to you after you bought it. Today, colloquially, we usually talk about open source as freely available. Like, doesn't actually cost any money, but technically, it theoretically could. But usually, you do need software developers when you're using most open source software, so it's not totally free, but very different costs than standard off-the-shelf software. So the federal government has actually been doing open source for a really long time, like since the 70s. A lot of the foundations of the internet were built based on government-funded open source projects. But when we did software, and when I say we, I mean the collective we, not me, we're doing open source software in the 70s. It was really more like publishing. People created it, and they put it up on a server, and people could download it. But it wasn't really expected that, that people would give back to it so much. And that was a much more awkward thing to do. There's more rigmarole around contributing to open source software back then. But now, there's tens of thousands of open source projects in government. This is GovCode, russ.org, which is a website that just pulls in open source repositories and surfaces them, and you can go browse that if you're a developer or if you're looking for open source. And there's an enormous number of projects of greater or lesser value that are out there. And, and so I want to go briefly into how we use open source software at 18F. We create it, consume it, contribute to it, and create a community around it. So first, creating it. Almost everything we do is open source, and we work in the open. So what does that mean? This is a website we've been working on, beta.fec.gov, so for the Federal Election Commission. So all of this source code for this website is available. If you're not the Federal Election Commission, you maybe aren't super excited about the source code for this particular website, but it creates a level of transparency that is important for this team. And you can actually fill out this feedback form, and it goes right into the open source repository, which has an issues list. And so it's transparent, the feedback that people are giving, and you can see the responses of the team, and you can see the source code. And if you're passionate about the work of the Federal Election Commission, you could even contribute to this project. The other way we create open source code is we actually create things that are very reusable. The digital analytics project that GSA created for 2 years worked to get most government websites to use the same analytics code. And then 18F built this dashboard to show the aggregate analytics of federal websites. And then the city of Philadelphia took the code, and they said, OK, now we can see analytics for a Philadelphia website. So you can see that these things are very similar. They just have kind of logo differences. But Philadelphia did what we call like forking the code, which just means you make sort of a lightweight copy of it. It's a very simple thing to do nowadays. And then they could leverage what we've done and put it up very, very easily. We also consume open source code. So our work is made faster because we use modern tools and libraries that are all open source. And so these, we typically just find these things on the internet. We know them. And we use hundreds and hundreds of different little bits of software. So for example, like these in the Ruby language, which is one of the languages we use, there are these things called gems, which are little Ruby bits. And like this is just probably half of the gems in one of our projects. So it's very common for us to use 50 little bits of software that are that are made available by other people on the internet. And these things are, they could be a few hundred lines of code. They could be many tens of thousands of lines of codes. And these are things that have a community behind them. We vet them. We make sure that they're good and solid. And the other thing that we do is we fork other people's projects. So Honolulu Answers was done by Code for America for the city of Honolulu, which was like a natural language answer finding thing. And the city of Oakland forked it, and they used it. And then we used it for the US Citizen Immigration Services website. So they had a problem where people don't know. They have questions about immigration, and it was a very similar problem. So we just used that source code. We put a different skin on it. You can see that these things look more substantially different. They have a different front end, but the logic that drives them is very, very similar. And so we have this like kind of engine we can reuse. And that saves an enormous amount of time and money. Of course, you have to select carefully, and you have to do this with thought. But it's very, very exciting to see these things used across the civic landscape. We also contribute to open source. So whenever we're using open source code, we always try to be responsible members of the community. So this could be as simple as writing a bug report, like, oh, I'm using this thing, and it's not working for me, and I'm going to report that back to the contributors. That's a great way of being involved in the community. If you start to use open source code and it's not working for you, like it is, it's sort of part of our ethos that you should let people know about it. You should, go find their site, and usually people would be very excited to hear that you tried it and what you ran into. Sometimes we make code fixes. We depended on this particular library. The tests weren't very robust, and we were depending on it. So we improved the test code. In this other example, we were using this like authentication library, and we needed it to do something more. So Mike Bland, who's a member of our team, added a feature that was accepted back into the project. The other thing we do, which most people outside of open source don't realize is a thing, is we create a community around the open source projects that we work on. So this is a document which tells how to install our software, one of the software packages, applications that we work on. You can see on the left, those are all the different people who have contributed each different line of this, instructions on how to install the software. And this is really common because installing the software changes all the time, and every different person runs into different things. And so one of the first things a developer often does is they're like, oh, I'm going to fix the install instructions because I've just found that they're broken. And this is an incredible service. Not only does it mean that more people can then install our software and help us, but then it means that anytime we have a new engineer, they're very quick on-ramp. So that's really high value that we're just getting from the community because it's open source and because we engage the community. We have hack nights. So at hack nights, as you might expect, people write code, they fix bugs, they make improvements to our software. We also do UX design work at hackathons. They're a great place to do usability testing. Sometimes designers come and give us ideas. And engagement also happens online. So we use this tool called Slack, which is like a chat service. And we can create public chat channels. So we really try to create the conversations that we have about the source code. We create ways for the public to engage. And in our contributing guidelines, we don't just talk how to technically contribute to the software. We talk about how we communicate. Because the more that we tell people what our roadmap is and what we're trying to achieve, the more that the contributions are going to actually accelerate our work rather than being distractions. And then we have online meetings. So this is a meeting we had last year with two of us from 18F, our colleague from the State Department, and Alan, who had just contributed based on the hackathon. And so that's an example. We don't always have members from the public at our meetings, but it's always fun when we do. So the software, we really have this vision for a different kind of way that the federal government, that all governments might deliver software to our people in the future. That we're not just delivering services for people. We're creating services with people. And in many times, we can collaborate with citizens so that the services are also by them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Do we have any questions right off the bat? We have one. Okay, good.
So everything about your entire project screams collaboration and participate with us. And you get to the website, which I just did, and it said federal government employees only. So I don't know if there's a limiting factor, if it's just that's the nature of the project, and put that firewall in there.
So the question
Can I repeat the question?
Yeah, repeat the question.
Oh, or were you
So
gonna
yeah, the Open Opportunities website, if you go to openops.digitalgov.gov, it is for federal employees only. So that, the root of that is that there are a lot of laws about how people collaborate. There are some people who think that maybe like those laws mean that it's actually illegal for federal employees to collaborate with other federal employees in any respect. So it turns out it's not illegal to collaborate. It's a thing. However, there are special forms that have to be filled out for some agencies when you collaborate with the public. we wanted to not have lots of forms, and we wanted to not confuse people. So to create comfort around this collaborative space, we made it federal employees only, so that we could have a minimum of checkboxes and forms. And to some degree, there's just some comfort with it being a semi-private space. All of the things are open, which really increases collaboration, but the actual collaboration is by federal employees. But the software is open source. So you can go to github.com/18f/openops-platform, and that software is available for anybody to use.
Any other questions?
In which the state of California will be looking at that and working with both of you in the very near future.
So, any questions? Because I have one that I've been dying to ask Sarah.
Yes.
So people usually like to leave with something from conferences other than bouncing balls from the vendors. And one of the questions that I had, if I were running a project like where I would have to hire a vendor, where do I start? How do I make a project open source? What would be the things that I would do to make an open source successful software application?
That's a great question. So I think that one good start is to put in your RFP that you want your vendor to work in an open source way. Because that will cause vendors who work in open source to want to respond. And I would also add that you should ask your vendor to do open source from day one. So this is something where I was surprised that not everybody, I mean, maybe I shouldn't be surprised, but a lot of people, I don't know if it's most people, I haven't done statistical analysis, a lot of people are like, well, we should get our act together, and then it should be open source. Let's make sure it's good, and then have it be open source. The challenge is that, when is that line, right? When is the line that it's like, now it's ready to be open source? Well, it's never ready. And if you start open source, your very first commit, all I have in my repo is a README, then everybody knows that you're not done yet. And the developers know that when they're committing, it's open, so that every single time anybody puts in a line of code, they're aware of all the things that one should be aware to make it open. And it's much, much faster to do it with every small change than to try to do some kind of audit halfway through.
Any other questions? Go ahead, Dave.
For Sarah, you know, you're a successful businesswoman, you've got a couple startups. What in the hell attracted you to federal government?
You didn't run screening.
So the question is, what attracted me to the federal government? Well, I heard Todd Parks speak. He has a trick, right, which he says, he spoke at the Lean Startup Conference, and he said, if anybody has an idea for innovation in government, send me email. And he spelled out his whole email address. So of course we all wrote down his email address, and then I ended up telling him an idea for the federal government, and he said I should apply as a Presidential Innovation Fellow, which I was like, yeah, right. But there's a longer story, but I'll tell you the short one because I'm seeing time. Basically, I believe that our democracy was at stake. This might sound odd, but you all remember the whole .com crash that happened? And it was, a lot of it was because there was stupid software that maybe nobody should have invested in. But a lot of it was because that stupid software was very, very expensive to run. We needed to do an internet startup in 1999. You needed physical boxes with software on them that were manually like maintained by humans, right? And that was very, very expensive. And that was how you built software companies. And the world changed in like, I don't know, somewhere in the 2000s with virtualization. And software got cheap to make. So there are as many stupid ideas now, I swear, as there were in 1999, but they're cheap and somebody's doing them in their basement or at a hackathon and then they're over in a week. And I realized, largely through conversations with people like Todd Park, that this was where that government was like in 1999, right? Or worse, right? And that if we did not, people like me, with skills like that I have, did not come help fix this, that it would just get more and more expensive while we're delivering worse and worse services to our people. And I pay plenty of taxes right now. My son was 16 years old at the time. I believed then, and I still believe now, that if we had not come to make this change, there's a good chance that he would not have had a government when he graduates from college. Because when your government gets super expensive and doesn't actually deliver any services to its people, like bad things happen. So it was really just a call that this is just has to be done, and there aren't a lot of people willing to do it. So if Todd Parks thinks that I have the skills and like it's actually possible, well, I'll do that experiment with him. And it turned out that, you know, I think it has made an impact. And I think we are on track for something different to happen. We're not done yet. A great question.
You didn't really talk about security. And in the government realm, that's kind of a big deal. Are there any downside to the everything open, all agile, do it and fail approach?
Question about security.
Please repeat the question, because I think it should be on the record.
Yeah, so I'll repeat the question. So I didn't really talk about security. Are there any downsides to open source and agile and fail fast when you have security to worry about? So we've had to do a lot of work to fail fast while going through all the government security hoops. Is one part of the answer, right? So there's an authority to operate process in the federal government. You probably have similar things in state and local government. That is a lot of checks that you have to go through to stand up a website. And we've done a lot of work to automate a lot of processes and make it faster to go through those checks. But the other thing is I was a little horrified to realize, because I've done, you know, I try not to put security on my resume because I don't actually like that work, but I've done a bunch of that stuff. And there's a bunch of stuff that I routinely do for security checks that was not on the government checklist. Plus, the standard government process takes 6 to 9 months. Do you know how many like patch releases of things come out in 6 to 9 months? And there are not enough processes to make sure that you're checking it regularly. So we put in additional checks to, you know, all the standard stuff that we're used to doing from industry. So the open source software, when used well, is more secure because it has more eyes on it. Plus, we need to layer in risk management in terms of security checks, which is not standard practice everywhere and really needs to be, so that we do have high security.
And one thing that open source software doesn't mean that it's open source, open data, right? So the data can be behind a secure login, but the way the application works is like a transparent house. You can see exactly how everything works. You just can't see the faces of the people that live there.
Good point.
Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I know in government there's a big issue with over-budget projects and projects that an end product in terms of software never, or typically seems like it doesn't meet the end goal, especially within budget. And I know that, we're going about projects differently with the agile approach to, small pieces, like saying, fail small, so big. Do you think it's actually making a change now that we're, especially maybe open source, to really, on smaller levels too? I mean, like, for example, our healthcare services and my division uses this specific software, and I think the life expectancy of that software is like 10, 20 years old in terms of what it's supposed to be, how long it's supposed to actually be useful for. And we keep talking about, oh, we're going to do new software, and it just keeps 10 years, and that was 20 years ago. Now we're like, okay, well, now 5 years, 10 years, it seems like it always gets put back to back. So I'm just curious, like, do you think, especially on that type of level, like the smaller level, I understand like it's being used on like a random level website backends and things like that, but like in terms of like, specific government programs, like for example, the Medi-Cal program, the MEDS program, the eligibility database system, that program is a whole system as well, and how we go about changing that database system into a newer version without huge cost.
So can we clarify the question?
Sure.
Yeah, so I
There
guess,
were a few questions in there. but-
yeah. One of the questions that you mentioned was basically how do you migrate data, so database migration to newer, more maintainable systems. That's one question that I picked.
Yeah, so that's, well, I think it's how do you deal with legacy systems, right? And actually, it was something I took off the slide from the 18F way that helped California because I thought it was confusing. But
Does everyone have 5 minutes more? So we've
Oh, are
finished this
we-
up? We're a little bit over, but people seem engaged.
Martin Fowler, who's pretty famous in the developer community, identified something he calls the Strangler Pattern, which is based on strangler vines, which actually like grow on trees and like create interesting shapes out of them. But the idea is that you fully encapsulate the legacy system and over time get rid of it. And you can put, they actually did this with healthcare.gov where they took, they had like the 2.0 team that took the forms that had like 80% of the people, you could do their form in like a much smaller, simpler interface. So they actually stood up a completely different website that was like the first healthcare.gov thing that was on AWS, and they just funneled the, if you answer these first few questions this way, then you're off in this different user experience. So there's lots of different ways that you can sort of start to take over the front end of the experience and, sometimes take out the back end, but basically start to surround it with new code until you have a whole new website. And that's generally much more resilient than a big rewrite. All right.
So we definitely ran out of time. I think there's more questions, but this was a really engaging talk. Thank you very much, Sarah,
It
for
was a
being
lot of
here.
fun.
And why don't we give Sarah another hand?